So if you're going to talk about it from a secular perspective, you need to know what that perspective is, right? That guy holding the pole is him. This was the Walk for Life last year. I designed this banner. It's one of my favorite. I didn't come up with the phrase. I just heard it somewhere, but I just think it's funny because what we're trying to say is you don't have to be a religious to think this is a bad thing, right? I think that tearing people's bodies apart is a bad thing, and I think most people agree with me even if they're not religious. So I'm going to go quickly over the general idea of the secular perspective. I'm sorry if I'm repeating stuff you've heard before, but I'll try to be fast. So the first premise is that a fetus is a human being. In fact, it's not really a premise, it's a fact. Like, forget how anybody feels, us or anybody else, about abortion. That's just a fact. The second premise is more philosophical and more subjective, which is that human beings should have human rights. But if we're going to do this from a secular perspective, we have to be able to explain that from a secular perspective, so I'll get to that in a second. First, the human being. The sources I put on this handout, I tried to make sure, first of all, that they were very objective, and second of all, that they were relatively sophisticated. I majored in chemical biology. I'm a huge fan of science, and I sort of am enamored with the idea that, you know, it's just truth, right? You just know that it's true. It's a little more complicated than that, but it is nice to be able to just verify physically something and just have it be true. So I'm really big on this premise. That being said, I purposely picked dictionary.com for the first part because I'm trying to show that what I'm about to tell you is not a new idea or a controversial or political idea, okay? When I say the fetus is a human being, I literally mean an individual of the genus Homo, especially a member of the species Homo sapiens. I'm not trying to do this trick where I insert this philosophical argument in the middle and then beg the question. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying anything about morals or philosophy. I'm speaking purely biologically when I say that a fetus is a human being. That is just a fact, okay? I put this slide together while I was visiting my sister, who's also going to City College, and she's also a science major, and I seriously just grabbed her biology book, which was printed this year. Fertilization is the fusion of the haploid sperm and the haploid ovum, or egg cell, to form a single diploid cell called the zygote. The fertilized ovum is now metabolically activated and stimulated to start development. The Endowment for Human Development, which the website's also on your sources, is not a political website. It's not related to abortion. It's just about talking about both fetal development and beyond. It's a pregnancy resource, totally neutral. And they say, biologically speaking, fertilization or conception is the beginning of human development. And then this embryology textbook from 2008 says the zygote, formed by the union of the oocyte, the egg cell, and a sperm, is the beginning of a new human being. And I just picked a few quotes, but you can find quote after quote after quote from embryology textbooks and from pregnancy resources that consistently say, from a scientific perspective, from a medical perspective, human development begins at fertilization. Everybody in this room, every pro-choicer or pro-lifer you will ever meet, started as a zygote. That's what human beings start at. And this is not a new thing. We've known about this for at least decades, okay? So you might get some pro-choicers still nowadays that will try to say very bizarre things like a fetus is a non-living cell, or what do you really mean by alive, or what do you mean by human, or what do you mean by organism. But in general, I find, and this is anecdotal, but I have found that that sort of mentality is on the decline. The more sophisticated pro-choicers who have actually argued about this more than once will punt this whole thing because it's a fact. It just gets embarrassing when you try to argue with it. And they'll say, okay, yes, the fetus is a human being, but it's not a person, right? Okay, so what do they mean by that? Now we're getting into a lot more subjective, okay? These are the most common definitions I've seen. Different people will say different things make you a person. There's no consensus on what this means from a philosophical standpoint, but the very most common ones I've seen are viability, right? You're not a person unless you can physically sustain your own life. Self-awareness, which I actually think is pretty interesting, because from a secular perspective, why do we value humanity? Why do we care, right? What's the difference between us and everybody else? And it's not the only answer, but one very obvious answer is our high cognitive function. So self-awareness, consciousness, rationality, if you don't have those things, you're not really a person. And then the third one is kind of a catch-all for the rest, because you can pick various other characteristics of level of development and say, you know, if you don't have a heartbeat, you're not a person. If you can't feel pain, you're not a person. This top left one, I've actually only heard a couple of times, saying you have to be like a member of society and have relationships to be a person. I'm going to put that aside right now because We don't think hermits aren't people. When we meet someone who has no friends, we don't think you're not a person, we just think you're a sad person, right? I don't know why that's there. I looked it up because I've heard it, but I don't think it makes any sense. So I'll go through the other ones, just to be clear. So, viability. This is Amila Taylor. She was born in Florida in 2006 at 21 weeks and 6 days gestation, which I think at the time was a world record. The reason I bring her up, she's like 5 or 6 now, or whatever she is because if she had been born in a different place with less technological capabilities, she would have died. Meaning that she wouldn't have been viable there, but she was viable here. Which makes the whole you have to be viably a person thing kind of weird, because that means that you're a person if your parents happen to live in Florida, but if you're in, I don't know, Sudan, then you're not a person. How can person possibly be dependent on your geography? Forget geography, how can personhood, which is a huge moral philosophical concept, be anything but intrinsic to the biological entity you're talking about, right? It has to be intrinsic. And I'm not the only one who's noticed this problem. So this is a quote from a 2008 paper published in the National Center for Biotechnology. Quote, "Viability exists as a function of biomedical and technological capacities which are different in different parts of the world. As a consequence, there is at the present time no worldwide uniform gestational age that defines viability. Viability is not an intrinsic property of the fetus because viability should be understood in terms of both biological and technological factors." So it doesn't really make sense to say that your personhood, depends, right? You either are a person or you're not. This one, self-awareness is actually, like I said before, I'm kind of empathetic to this point of view. I could see why you would feel like, especially if you're a secularist, if you're not even aware of yourself, if you can't even think, then what does that mean, right? I could kind of see that, but the problem is that there's already groups of people that we all generally have a consensus are people that don't have the self-awareness they're talking about. So the person on the left is a coma patient. It depends on the coma, but most comas you're not self-aware, some of them you come back from, some of them you don't, they don't really know, but the point is that we don't suddenly think that once you fall into a coma you're not a person. You're a person that is sick, or perhaps they see it as a disability, but you're still a person. And more interestingly, the picture in the middle is just a picture I like, but the one on the right is newborns, right? Certainly Amila Taylor, 21 weeks, 6 days, she does not have the kind of self-awareness or consciousness that they're talking about at all. But even newborns born at 9 months. I don't have quotes here, but it's on the sources. There's a couple of scientific papers that talk about self-awareness and consciousness and how they develop over time after you're born. If you want to go really far, you can say that, the full adult brain isn't developed till late or post-teenagehood. And we certainly don't pretend teenagers aren't people, right? And it's not just pro-lifers that have noticed this problem, okay? There's a rather famous pro-choice philosopher named Peter Singer, and he has said infamous things like how killing a newborn could never be the same thing as killing a person. Because at least he's consistent. He says that in order to be a person, you have to have this certain level of consciousness, right? And he recognizes that not only does the fetus not have it, neither do newborns. So he still thinks it would be really terrible to kill newborns for whatever other reasons, social reasons, but he doesn't consider killing a newborn like killing a person. And and this is speaking purely personally now, I cannot bring myself to embrace a philosophy that sort of kind of rationalizes killing babies. And when I say babies, I don't mean fetuses, I mean babies born, okay? That's problematic to me. So, and in my experience, I've seen most pro-choicers also would completely shun that, and they try to sort of do this weird mental gymnastic thing to explain why it counts for the fetus but not the newborn, which immediately makes you kind of raise your eyebrow like, if you can't be consistent, you have to be consistent, otherwise there's no reason for me to listen to you. Because you don't really mean it. You're just deciding what you think, and then after you've decided, trying to make sure that you can rationalize it. It's not impressive. So that's the self-awareness thing. And the level of development covers a lot of different stuff. So the picture on the left is an 8-cell blastocyst, which is about 2 days after pregnancy, way before most women can even know they're pregnant. But it should be noted that there is a point in pregnancy when we are literally talking about a clump of cells. And it's 2 days after pregnancy. The one in the center is a 6-week-old fetus, which already has a heartbeat and brainwaves. And the one on the right is just an artistic depiction I like, because it starts with DNA, ends with the full-fledged fetus, so it's like the whole fetal development thing. Anyway, there's a lot of different characteristics people can pick for level of development that they personally feel you require for personhood. So you can talk about heartbeat, right? But the problem is that people on respirators who can't beat their own heart are still people. You can talk about the ability to feel pain, but lepers are people, right? You can talk about brain waves, which is a little bit more interesting because it's kind of going back to that self-awareness thing. We might not know the exact moment, even if it's post-birth, when you have the kind of consciousness they're talking about. But we do know that you can't possibly have it if you don't have brain waves. So it's sort of like moving it back a little bit and just saying before this, there's no way you have it. And I can kind of understand that mentality. By the way, brainwaves start at 6 weeks gestation, so even if we all agreed that this made sense, we'd have to radically change abortion laws as they stand in this country. But I still think it's problematic. Just to give you an idea in terms of the central nervous system development, at 2.5 weeks gestation, you have the neural groove and folds developed. And then at 3 weeks, the primary sections of the brain are visible. At 4.5 weeks, you can actually see the cerebral hemispheres. At 6 weeks is the aforementioned brainwaves. However, the cerebral cortex, which is what's responsible for our higher cognitive function, doesn't come about until 13 to 15 weeks. And as I said before, the full levels of consciousness don't come about till after birth. So we already know at 6 weeks that the thing they're saying is important isn't there, and you kind of have to wonder, like, it becomes more arbitrary when you look at it as sort of this continuum. Why did you decide that right there is when you're a person? It doesn't really make sense. I would argue that being the kind of thing that will have the abilities to have this cognition is what gives you value. We don't say that people with learning disabilities are subhuman or subpersons, right? They're people with disabilities. And we don't say that the newborn is a subhuman, like I said before, subperson. A fetus is a human being that just hasn't developed as much as we have, but it's going to. And that's what gives it value. And I'm not the only one who thinks this. So, science tells us the fetus is a human being, which is great. But science doesn't tell you what to do with information, it just gives it to you. It says the fetus is a human being, it doesn't say you have to care, right? There has to be a second part to the argument in order to hold a pro-life position. There are tons of pro-choicers who agree that the fetus is a human being, and they're still pro-choice. Why? Because that doesn't necessarily mean that the fetus deserves human rights.